Continuing our reading in the World and Thorinn by Damon Knight, Chapter 11, Section 5. Early the next morning, before the children were awake, Thorinn collected all his belongings, including the tightly wrapped bladder with its basket, and set out for the upper end of the cavern. He built himself a little shelter of branches near the cavern wall, within sight and sound of the cataract, and lay there that night. On the following day, he began cutting poles for a shed 10 ells long, 8 high, and 4 wide. He planted the poles on rising ground above the river and lashed other poles to them to make a peaked roof. He thatched the roof with bundles of branches to the thickness of half an ell. In the middle of the space covered by the shed, he dug a fire pit, and on either side he stacked dry wood from the forest. Then, with his sword, he cut through the trunks of 4 trees, forming a rough oblong around the shed, at a height of 15 ells. He notched the stumps and cut the logs into pieces 6 ells long, which he raised with much toil, using a rope and a tripod of poles, and set into place at the end of the oblong. He notched these in turn and now cut more logs 14 ells long, which he laid across the structure to form a solid, flat roof above the peaked roof of the shed, and with leather thongs flinched from the wingman's workshops, he lashed the whole structure firmly together. All through this work, which occupied him 14 days, the air was cloudless. On the 15th day, he built a fire in the pit and touched it off. The flames mounted, smoke poured up under the roof, and Thorinn retreated to the shelter of a nearby tree. Presently the rain began, first a patter, then a steady hammering in the leaves above. Thorinn shut his eyes and waited. There was an ear-splitting crack and a white glare that he could see through his eyelids. When he looked, he saw that the log roof above the shed was splintered but unbroken. The rain continued in a steady torrent. After a time, without warning, there was another lightning stroke and a clap of thunder. Again the roof was splintered. He could see the white spears standing up at all angles above it, but it held. The thatched roof beneath was not even touched. Thorinn watched until the rain began to splatter from the overloaded leaves of the trees above him. He ran to the shed, stayed there long enough to bank his fire, and ran back drenched to his shelter near the cliff. All day long the rain continued, and at intervals peals of thunder rolled down the valley, and the sky was lighted with a violent glare. Toward evening, Thorinn pulled his shirt over his head for a cloak and went down to the river. It was swollen and white-capped, twice as wide as before. He went back to the shelter, ate his evening meal, and fell asleep to the drumming of rain in the treetops. Sometime during the night he woke up realizing that the sound had stopped. He ran to the shed and found that the fire had gone out. Although the shed was intact and dry, he built the fire up again, waited as before until it was burning well, then banked it and went back to bed. In the morning the river was a surging brown flood. Thorinn ventured out of the shed, found the fire low, and built it up once more. The log roof was a mass of splinters from the repeated lightning strokes, but the splinters themselves, as he had hoped, made a roof almost as good for his purpose as the original. The river sprawled wider, creeping almost visibly up the slope by now. Thorinn thought, it must be almost to the wingman's towers. The stacks of wood were dwindling. Thorinn kept the fire going as charily as possible and watched the river. On the following morning it was halfway up the slope. Further down, he could see trees standing up out of it like marooned people. By now, surely the water must be in the middle stories of the towers. For the first time, he began to doubt what he was doing. Would the invisible watchers really let the winged people's farms be flooded, their buildings swept away? He banked the fire again and went to bed, but it was long before he was asleep. In the morning, he awoke knowing that something had happened. He listened. The roar of the cataract had changed its note. He tumbled out and peered upward. Was the stream thinner, or was it his imagination? In a moment he was sure. A light white plume, last of all, came majestically down the wall. Above it, he could see the dripping black hole in the stone. Thornton's instinct was for haste, but he made himself take the time to build up the fire again, then to assemble all his belongings into one compact bundle to be strapped on his back. He had decided against trying to inflate the bladder here and use it to reach the exit. In the first place, it would take too long, and second, he might drift up out of reach of the wall. Instead, he had brought with him a pot of pitch and 2 of the wingman's brushes. Hanging the pot from his belt, he dipped one of the brushes now, slapped it against the stone, and pulled himself upward. As the sluggish weight of his bundle was drawn into motion, his task became easier. He tugged one brush free, dipped the other, and slapped it against the stone above his head. He angled toward the hole in the wall as he went. He could see the interior now, still glistening with moisture, and a few thready streams of water that fell over the lip to join the drifting raindrops. The ground dropped away below him, blurred by rain. Here was the hole above him. He hauled himself up, grasped the lip, and pulled himself over. He sat up, gasping and triumphant. He was in a slanting tunnel 20 ells high, with rounded walls worn smooth by water. That's the end of chapter 11.